Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. Joining us now, Matt Duss. He's Executive Vice President at the Center for International Policy. Matt, welcome back to the program.
Thanks very much.
Give us your assessment. I mean, obviously, there has been a leading up to the Iranian retaliatory strike. I don't know how else really to reference it on Israel. There seemed to be a growing push in the Senate, maybe even in the House as well, to conditioning aid to Israel. Characterize first, like, the Iranian response to Israel hitting its consulate in Syria, and then what supposedly has happened in terms of like the growing skepticism about funding Israel.
Right. So, yeah, as you mentioned, on April 1st, Israel struck an Iranian consulate in Damascus, Syria, killing a number of senior Iranian military officials. Iran waited, several weeks before responding, but made clear that they would respond. And the way they did was to launch a series of drones and missiles into Israel. Now, it did not kill anyone. It injured a young Arab Bedouin girl who was apparently in very serious condition. But that was in part, I think, intentional, but also on Iran's part, but also because there was a very well-coordinated response by the United States, Israel, other allies, including Arab allies in the region, to share intelligence to knock down a lot of those drones and missiles as they were on their way. But I do think it's worth noting that there were communications between Iran and the United States making clear that Iran would be ready to de-escalate after it kind of did what it had to do. That's certainly not to defend its striking in Israel. We should, absolutely not accept that. But I do think there was an interest, as we've seen all along, that Iran does not want to get drawn into a wider open escalatory conflict, and neither does the United States. Unfortunately, it's unclear whether Israel shares that right now.
Well, I mean, it seems clear that they were trying to provoke. I mean, you don't need to speculate on it, but it seems clear that they're trying to provoke some sort of response to galvanize Western support. But my assessment, Matt, is that Iran didn't apparently use their best missiles in this area. They telegraphed it for around 2 weeks. I mean, what's your view of how intimately the United States was involved in getting them to kind of do this for show to a degree versus retaliate in the way that would have been more deadly?
Right. Again, I think it's been clear to the U.S. That Iran does not want to escalate past a certain point, but because of the seriousness and, again, the unprecedented nature in its own right of the Israeli strike on the consulate, on this diplomatic facility in Damascus, it felt that it needed to respond. But it made clear that it understood it did not want to respond beyond a certain level that would create a worse, uncontrollable escalation. Now, I think the idea that one can control violent military escalations is itself a kind of dangerous illusion. But there was at least messages sent between the U.S. and Iran that made clear that Iran needed to do something, but they would be ready to step back after this was done. And as you said, the Israeli government, Benjamin Netanyahu knows that his political career depends on sustaining, prolonging, and possibly expanding this war beyond just Gaza. They've clearly, reaped a benefit in kind of international opinion now that they have been attacked on their territory by Iran, and so attention is off Gaza for the time being. I don't expect that to last very long, given that the catastrophe continues in Gaza, is continuing to get worse. Famine is continuing. But for the time being, Israel has kind of gotten a win out of this.
I want to go on to just how strategic what Iran did was, but how far from the realm of possibility is it that Iran not just communicated, we have no interest in escalating after this, but also, incidentally, here are the coordinates from where we intend to more or less I mean, is that an absurd concept, or is it very possible? Because there is a real quality to this that felt like Iran felt that they need to do it. We can talk about maybe why they felt they needed to do that, but how out of realm of possibility is that they coordinated where they were going to attack?
It's not clear to me. I've seen no evidence or heard anything that indicates it was that specific. I do think it's clear that there was some communication, as I said, that we need to respond, but we will be ready to de-escalate after. But I think that one of the reasons I'm skeptical of that, the information shared was that specific is because just as, the United States and Israel and others gained some intelligence and information about the nature of Iran's response and their capabilities, although even as Emma said, I don't think they showed their full capabilities here. Iran also gained intelligence and information regarding the response by Israel and the United States, its allies, Jordan and others, how that intelligence would be shared, and how. So they are also taking that into account for a potential future engagement.
All right, interesting.
And that they would not have been able to gather that information had they shared much more specific coordinates the way you suggested.
What was the were there pressures on Iran to respond? I mean, for instance, I read this interview with Richard Haas, where he said his perspective was that Iran made a strategic mistake because it made Israel a little bit more sympathetic at a time where Israel was becoming increasingly isolated and more and more of a pariah. Putting aside the question as to whether there has really been a narrative turn and if it's durable, what is your perspective on that, and why would Iran? I understand why they, that it was retaliatory, but do they have domestic pressures that they're dealing with, or is it this is a freebie where they can basically make an assessment of what the defense mechanisms are?
No, I would tend to agree with Haas there. I do think overall this was a bad decision by Iran. It does, it's seen as a win for Israel. So from Iran's perspective, this was an overstep. But again, as we know very well here, internal politics can often make you do stupid things in foreign policy. That's true, and it's certainly true for the United States as it is for other countries, and I think this was an example of that.
But why was it stupid though, Matt? I mean, I feel like we're asking Iran to act in a way that we would not ask any other country to react. I mean, they have now shown restraint in two separate instances with assassinations of their generals. When it came to Soleimani, they clearly coordinated that response with the United States. And now in this strike on their consulate in Damascus, they had to respond to Israel here to establish some sort of deterrence. It just seems like a rational way for an actor to behave in this way.
Oh, right. I tend to agree in terms of we can imagine a much more vigorous and aggressive response. So I totally agree that there was a level of restraint that existed here. But I'm just saying, like, even if I acknowledge Iran's need to respond for a whole set of reasons, I can agree with the analysis that they came out of this, in a bit worse of a position than they were the day before.
Gotcha.
Do you have a sense of where we are now? It was announced today that Mike Johnson intends to introduce 4 different aid bills. I guess presumably because there are people in his caucus, and he knows there are people in the Democratic caucus who might want to vote for Ukraine funding, but not for Israel funding. Whereas I suspect there's a decent amount of Republicans who want to vote for Israel funding and not Ukraine funding. What is your sense of what that bill looks like if it makes it to the Senate, and B, what's happening in the Senate?
I wish I had a smart answer here, but I feel like we're just playing Calvin ball at this point.
Right.
In the House, I'm hearing this morning that, Massey was telling Johnson that he's going to be kicked out soon. So who knows which of these bills will actually make it to the floor, what the votes will be, what vehicle will be sent over to the Senate. I tend to agree with the idea that it was a mistake to combine all of these spending bills, Ukraine, Israel, in the first place. I think we should have up or down votes on these things. So if that happens, I think that could potentially be good. But again, I know better than to predict what's going to happen in the Republican-led House at this point.